In November of 2009, a 26-year-old medical student named John Jones was back home in Utah to celebrate the Thanksgiving holiday with his family. John was a happily married man, the father of a beautiful 1-year-old daughter, and his wife was actually pregnant with their second child. He had a bright future ahead of him, but like anyone in the middle of medical school, he was constantly under a lot of stress. So, when he got back to Utah, he was really looking forward to just shutting his brain off, relaxing, and catching up with his relatives. During his visit, someone in the family pointed out that it had been years since they had all gone cave exploring together. Growing up, John, his younger brother Josh, and their father were avid spelunkers. They had traveled all over the place exploring underground caverns. But as they got older, life got in the way, and they had not done it in a very long time. Everyone thought this was a brilliant idea. It felt like the perfect way to reconnect and have some old-fashioned fun. So, John, his 23-year-old brother Josh, and 9 other friends and family members got a group together and made plans to head out to a place called Nutty Putty Cave. This was a very popular spelunking location in their area, but despite its popularity, nobody in John's family had actually ever set foot inside of it. On the evening of November 24th, 2009 at around 8 p.m., the group arrived at the entrance of Nutty Putty Cave. They put on their helmets, turned on their headlamps, and made their way inside. At first, everything went smoothly. They successfully navigated down to a section of the cave known as the Big Slide. This area was not particularly challenging. It was wide enough for everyone to move around easily, and it was a lot of fun. But for John, who used to tackle much more difficult caves when he was younger, the Big Slide just felt too easy. He wanted to push himself. He wanted to feel that old rush of adrenaline. So he looked at his brother Josh and suggested they split off from the main group. He wanted to go find the most famous and challenging section of the cave, a notoriously tight passage called the Birth Canal. Josh was completely on board. So the two brothers said goodbye to the rest of the group and set off deeper into the cave system. They had a basic map with them, and they did their absolute best to follow the twists and turns. After crawling through a series of narrow passages, John, who was leading the way, stopped. Right in front of him, at about waist height, was a small hole in the cave wall. John looked at his map, looked at the hole, and became convinced that this was the entrance to the birth canal. Now the problem was that when John was growing up and doing all this cave exploring, he was a child. He was much smaller back then. But now, John was a fully grown, athletic, 26-year-old man. He stood 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. But in his mind, he still felt like that flexible kid who could squeeze through anything. Without a second thought and without testing the space first, John slid himself headfirst right into the waist-high hole. He began painstakingly inching his way down the tunnel. Almost immediately, the space became incredibly tight. The rock walls pressed hard against his chest and back. His arms were pinned underneath his body, making it impossible to use his hands to push himself forward or backward. With every single movement he made, the cave seemed to grip him tighter and tighter. But John was absolutely convinced that this was the birth canal. He knew from stories that the birth canal was supposed to be a tight squeeze. He figured that if he just pushed past the discomfort and the intense claustrophobia, he would eventually reach the other side where the tunnel opened up into a wider chamber. So, he kept pushing. He used his toes to propel himself deeper and deeper into the pitch-black, suffocatingly narrow tube. Eventually, John reached a point where he was completely wedged. He could not move forward, and he certainly could not move backward. He had a tiny bit of tunnel still visible in front of him, and he could see that the passage made a sharp bend downward. He thought to himself that if he could just get past this one last tight spot, he would finally reach the opening. But there was a physical obstacle in his way. Right beneath his rib cage, there was a sharp lip of rock sticking up from the floor of the tunnel. It was catching on his chest. In a desperate bid to get past it, John exhaled all of the air out of his lungs, making his chest as small as possible, and slid himself just past the rock lip. But as soon as he did, he took a deep breath in. His chest expanded, and his rib cage immediately locked right against that sharp lip of rock. He was completely stuck, and then he got a better look at the tunnel ahead of him. His heart sank. The tunnel did not open up at all. It simply dead-ended into a solid rock wall. It was not the birth canal, it was an unmarked, unexplored, and incredibly dangerous fissure in the cave. John was trapped, and to make things infinitely worse, the tunnel was angled downward. John was almost completely upside down. John called out to his brother Josh, his voice echoing off the tight stone walls. He told Josh that he was stuck and could not move. Josh, hearing the panic in his brother's voice, immediately started crawling down the tunnel after him. But the passage was so small that Josh almost immediately got stuck himself. From his position, Josh could barely see the soles of John's shoes way down in the darkness. He realized that if he was having this much trouble up here, John was in extreme danger. Josh carefully backed himself out of the tunnel, gasping for air. He yelled down to John that he was going to go get help, and then he ran as fast as he could toward the entrance of the cave. But because they were so deep inside this complex remote cave system, it took a staggering 3.5 hours for the very first rescue worker to arrive on the scene. That first rescuer was a woman named Susie Motola. When Susie finally reached the opening of the crevice, she called out to John to see how he was doing. John's voice sounded incredibly distant and muffled. He told Susie that he was glad she was there, but he really wanted to get out. Susie tried to reassure him. She told him they were going to get him out in no time and that everything was going to be fine. But when Susie actually looked down into the tiny crevice, her heart sank. She realized this was going to be an absolute nightmare of a rescue. Just getting the equipment down to this part of the cave was incredibly difficult, let alone setting up a complex pulley system to pull a 6-foot, 200-pound man out of a vertical, jagged tube. This was not going to be a matter of minutes. It was going to take hours, maybe even days. But the problem was, John did not have days. The human body is designed to be upright. Gravity is supposed to help the heart pump blood throughout the body. When a person is suspended upside down, blood begins to pool in their brain and lungs. The heart has to work incredibly hard to pump blood against gravity, and eventually, the cardiovascular system simply shuts down. When a trauma physician arrived on the scene and learned that John had already been upside down for over 3.5 hours before rescuers even reached him, he pulled Susie and the other rescue workers aside. He told them flat out that John probably only had 8 to 10 hours left to live. The clock was ticking and they had to act fast. The rescuers tried absolutely everything they could think of. At first, they tied a heavy rope around John's legs and tried to simply yank him out. But the angle was all wrong, and the friction against the rock was too intense. It did not work. Next, they spent hours rigging an incredibly elaborate pulley system, anchoring the ropes deep into the cave walls. They began to pull, but the rock in Nutty Putty Cave was notoriously soft and crumbly. The heavy metal anchors kept ripping right out of the stone walls. Every time they got close to making progress, the anchors would fail and they would lose all their ground. It was taking hours just to set up the equipment, only to move John a fraction of an inch. Desperate, some of the rescuers crawled as close as they could with drills and chisels. They began chipping away at the rocks surrounding John, trying to widen the tunnel. But the space was so confined that they could barely move their arms. The progress was practically non-existent, and it was taking far too much time. As the hours dragged on, the rescuers noticed a terrifying change in John. His breathing was becoming heavily labored, and his voice sounded thick and nasally. This was a clear sign that fluid was rapidly building up inside of his lungs. They were entering his final hours. At one point, after hours of grueling work, they finally managed to get the pulley system to hold. They began to pull, and John actually moved up a couple of inches. But as they looked down, they realized they had run into a catastrophic obstacle. Because of the sharp, zigzagging angle of the crevice John had crawled into, his legs were bent at an unnatural angle. If they continued to pull him straight up, his legs would hit the ceiling of the passage. His legs simply would not bend in the direction required to get him around the sharp rock corner. The only way to get him out using the pulley system was to literally break both of his legs. But John's breathing was already shallow and he was barely responsive. The medical team on site knew that if they broke his legs, the sheer physical trauma would immediately send his body into profound shock, which would kill him instantly. The rescuers stood there in the dim light of their headlamps, exhausted and devastated. They realized there was nothing more they could do. They could not get John out. He was going to die in that cave. 27 hours after John Jones first slid headfirst into that unmarked tunnel, he stopped responding to the rescuers. A medical professional crawled down as far as they could and officially declared him dead. The 26-year-old medical student was gone, leaving behind his grieving wife, his 1-year-old daughter, and his unborn child who would enter the world the following June without ever knowing his father. Following the tragedy, authorities decided that attempting to recover John's body was simply too dangerous and risked the lives of future search and rescue teams. So, with the family's permission, Nutty Putty Cave was permanently closed. Rescuers poured concrete down the entrance, sealing it off forever. To this very day, John's body remains resting inside the dark, silent depths of Nutty Putty Cave, a permanent headstone for a young man whose life was cut tragically short. Long before John Jones entered Nutty Putty Cave, a man named Ed Gein was living in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, and he was always considered a little bit off. Growing up, Ed's classmates and teachers remembered him as an incredibly shy and awkward boy. He rarely spoke to anyone, but every now and then he would exhibit these very strange mannerisms. Out of nowhere, in the middle of a quiet classroom, Ed would burst out into hysterical laughter. He would usually be muttering something under his breath, laughing at some private joke that only he could hear. The school staff often blamed Ed's mother, Augusta, for his bizarre behavior. Augusta was an incredibly domineering and religious woman. Ed would openly admit to people that his mother would severely punish him if he ever showed any signs of making friends at school. Because of this, Ed's childhood was one of absolute loneliness and isolation. Augusta confined Ed and his brother Henry to their remote family farm. They were almost never allowed to leave except to go to school. And when they were at home, Augusta would spend hours reading terrifying passages from the Bible, constantly drilling into their heads that everyone else in the world was inherently evil and corrupt. She told them that their family was the only pure one left, and that they had to stay away from the outside world at all costs. In 1944, when Ed was 38 years old, he and his brother Henry were out on their property burning away some dry marsh vegetation. At some point during the afternoon, the fire got completely out of control. The flames spread rapidly, and the local fire department had to be called in to help put it out. After the fire was successfully extinguished, Ed was found standing by himself, completely unharmed. But Henry was nowhere to be found. He had vanished. That night, a search party was organized and they headed out into the dark, smoky marsh. It did not take long for them to find Henry's body. He was lying face down in an unburned section of the marsh. The medical examiner concluded that Henry had died of asphyxiation. Initially, everyone assumed he had simply been overcome by the smoke from the fire. But as the authorities investigated further, they discovered something highly suspicious. Henry had actually died before the fire had even reached that part of the property, and there were bruises on his head. Naturally, all eyes turned to Ed. He was the only person with Henry when the fire started. But there was no hard physical evidence connecting Ed to his brother's death, and Ed insisted he had nothing to do with it. So, Henry's death was officially ruled an accident, even though almost everyone in town suspected that Ed had strangled his brother to death before setting the fire to cover his tracks. Shortly after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a series of strokes and passed away, leaving Ed entirely alone in the massive, isolated farmhouse. With his mother gone, Ed began to make some very strange modifications to the home. He did not do this to make the house nicer or more comfortable. Instead, he took heavy wooden boards and completely sealed off every single room in the house that his mother had ever used. He boarded up her bedroom, her sitting room, and the parlor. He turned them into virtual time capsules, leaving everything exactly as she had left it. He did not touch a single item in those rooms. Instead, Ed confined himself to a single small room located off the kitchen. He stopped taking care of the rest of the house, and over the years, filth and clutter began to pile up everywhere. He lived in absolute squalor, surrounded by garbage and rotting food. It was during this period of intense seclusion that Ed developed a dark, consuming obsession. He began reading endlessly about cannibalism, headhunters, and the atrocities committed in Nazi concentration camps. He spent all of his time in that dirty little room, reading these graphic books by the light of a single lamp. And for the next 10 years, this was how he lived. He was a ghost in the community. People knew he lived out on the farm, but no one ever really saw him. Then, in November of 1957, a local hardware store owner named Bernice Worden suddenly went missing. When the police showed up at her store to investigate, they found a gruesome scene. There were heavy bloodstains splashed across the floor, and the cash register was wide open. When they looked at the store's sales log, they saw that the very last transaction of the day was for a gallon of antifreeze, and the person who had bought it was Ed Gein. The police immediately drove out to Ed's remote farmhouse to interview him. They were bracing themselves to potentially find Bernice's body hidden somewhere on the property, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer terror that was waiting for them inside that house. What they discovered would go on to shock the entire world and inspire some of the most famous horror movies in history, including Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Inside Ed's house, investigators found a massive collection of human remains. But it was how these remains were being used that was truly horrifying. Ed had taken human body parts and turned them into everyday household items. The police found bowls fashioned from human skulls and kitchen utensils decorated with human bones. He had used human skin to upholster the seats of his chairs, and he had made lampshades and bedposts wrapped in skin. There were shoeboxes filled with human organs, and a collection of severe, preserved faces hanging on the wall like masks. As the police searched further into the freezing, dark house, they finally located the body of Bernice Worden. She had been hung upside down from the rafters of the ceiling, decapitated and dressed like a deer, clearly prepared to be carved up and turned into more household items. When the police interrogated Ed, he immediately confessed to the murder of Bernice Worden. But when they asked him about the dozens of other body parts scattered throughout his home, Ed claimed that he had not killed those people. Instead, he claimed that he had spent years visiting local cemeteries under the cover of darkness, digging up recently buried graves of middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. The authorities tried to verify his claims, but because of the sheer chaos and state of decay of the remains, they were never able to definitively link Ed to any other murders beyond Bernice Worden and another local woman who had disappeared years prior. When they asked Ed why he had done all of this, his answer was deeply disturbing. He told investigators that he had wanted to build what he called a woman's suit. He wanted to sew together a suit made of real human skin that would perfectly resemble his mother, Augusta. Ed's plan was to literally crawl into his mother's skin so that he could feel close to her again. Ed Gein was ultimately deemed mentally unfit to stand trial due to his severe schizophrenia and was committed to a maximum security psychiatric hospital. He remained there, quiet and cooperative, until he passed away from cancer in 1984. Ed Gein became one of the most notorious figures in American history, a man whose quiet, awkward exterior masked a level of depravity that most people could not even begin to comprehend. Decades after Ed Gein's arrest on the opposite side of the country, another man was preparing for an adventure in the great outdoors. In 1985, Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old outdoor enthusiast living in Sacramento, California. Kevin absolutely loved being out in nature. He spent all of his free time hiking, backpacking, and camping in some of the most rugged terrain California had to offer. But Kevin had a dream. He had always wanted to test his skills in the ultimate wilderness, Alaska. By the summer of 1985, Kevin decided it was finally time to make his dream a reality. He began doing extensive research on different areas in Alaska where he could go for a long, solo camping trip. He wanted something truly remote, and he eventually settled on Glacier Bay National Park. Even by Alaskan standards, Glacier Bay is incredibly wild, vast, and completely isolated. There are no roads, no cell service, and absolutely no quick way to get help if something goes wrong. Because Kevin was planning on going entirely by himself, he knew he needed to be fully prepared. He was a smart, experienced hiker, so he actually enrolled in and completed a specialized survival class designed to teach people how to survive the harsh and unpredictable Alaskan wilderness. On September 20th, 1985, Kevin boarded a flight from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska. From Juneau, he took a boat up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park's headquarters, he made a point to go inside and introduce himself to the park rangers on duty. He wanted them to know exactly where he was going. He told the rangers that he was going to be setting up his camp near the Wolf Point area, which was a very remote spot right along the water. He explained that he planned to stay out there for about 3 weeks, and that he would be packing up and leaving the park on October 10th. The rangers noted his plans. They knew that there was this experienced, well-prepared guy named Kevin O'Keefe out by himself near the water, and they promised to keep an eye out for him during their routine patrols. For the next couple of weeks, neither the rangers nor Kevin's family heard a single word from him. But that was exactly what Kevin wanted. The whole point of the trip was to unplug from society, escape reality, and just live in peace with nature. So nobody was worried. On October 8th, just 2 days before Kevin was scheduled to end his trip and return home, a couple of park rangers were out in a boat patrolling the waterways around Wolf Point. Because they were in the area, they decided to take a quick detour and head into Wolf Point to check on Kevin. They figured they would say hello, see how his trip went, and make sure he was ready for his departure in 2 days. But as the rangers rounded the last rocky corner and Kevin's campsite finally came into view, they immediately knew that something was seriously wrong. The first thing they noticed was that Kevin's tent was not where it was supposed to be. There was a clear, flat spot of soil where a tent should have been pitched, but the tent had been moved. It was sitting several meters away, down on the gravel beach that bordered the campsite. Some of his gear was sitting outside the tent, placed on the sand. It was not scattered around like there had been a chaotic struggle, but it was just sitting out in the elements. As they got closer to the tent, they saw that the top fiberglass strut that held the roof of the tent up was completely folded down. It had snapped right in the middle, causing the entire tent to partially collapse. The rangers called out Kevin's name, but there was no response. The campsite was completely silent. At first, the rangers tried to rationalize what they were seeing. They figured that since Kevin was leaving in 2 days, maybe he was in the process of packing up his camp. Perhaps he had moved his tent down to the beach to shake the dirt off of it, and maybe the wind had broken the pole. They thought he might have just gone off on a short day hike and would be back shortly. So they decided not to panic. They got back in their boat and left, planning to return the next day to double check. When the rangers returned to Wolf Point the following morning, they were horrified to see that absolutely nothing had changed. The tent was still sitting collapsed on the beach, and the gear was still sitting untouched on the sand. It was now painfully clear that Kevin had not been back to his campsite in at least 24 hours. The rangers officially declared an emergency and launched a massive search and rescue operation. They began flying small planes over the dense forests and rocky shorelines of Wolf Point, searching for any sign of a campfire or a brightly colored jacket. On the ground, teams of searchers and trained tracking dogs combed the area. But as they searched, the mystery only grew deeper. When they examined Kevin's campsite, they realized that virtually all of the essential survival equipment you would need in Alaska was still there. His backpack was fully packed and leaning against a tree as if he had been getting ready to go on a hike. Inside the pack was his food, his extra warm clothes, and his water filter. His sleeping bag, sleeping pad, and cooking stove were all still at the site. Strangely, there was a large amount of food left out in the open at the campsite. In Alaska, leaving food out like that is an open invitation for grizzly bears, wolves, and foxes. But absolutely none of the food had been touched by animals. It was completely pristine. As the search dogs pushed further out into the thick brush surrounding the campsite, they suddenly picked up a scent. About a half-mile away, tucked deep inside a steep, rocky gully, the dogs located Kevin's boots, his glove liners, and his hat. These items were hidden so deeply in the brush that they were completely invisible to the naked eye. The searchers were baffled. Why would an experienced hiker take off his boots, his gloves, and his hat and leave them in a gully a half-mile away from his camp? In the freezing Alaskan autumn, going barefoot is a death sentence. The initial theory was that Kevin must have been attacked by a bear. But the park rangers, who had spent their entire lives in this wilderness, quickly ruled that out. They had seen bear attacks before, and they knew what they looked like. There was absolutely no sign of a struggle at the campsite. If a human is attacked by a massive predator, they are going to fight for their life. There will be torn fabric, broken branches, deep foot scars in the dirt, and blood. There was none of that. There was not a single drop of blood anywhere. And if a bear had entered the camp, it would have eaten the food that was left out in the open. But the food was untouched. In fact, the rangers noted that it seemed like wild animals were actively avoiding the campsite, which was incredibly unusual. The investigators contacted Kevin's family back in California. They asked if Kevin had been depressed, or if there was any chance he had gone out there to end his own life. The family was shocked by the question. They said absolutely not. Kevin was incredibly happy, well-adjusted, and had been looking forward to this trip for months. He had taken survival classes specifically to ensure he would make it home safely. He had told his family that he planned to take short-day hikes, but no overnight trips away from his main camp. But because all of his gear, including his boots and his backpack, was still at the site, he clearly had not left for a planned hike. Something unexpected had happened to him while he was right there at his camp. But after several days of intensive searching with no new clues, the search had to be called off. Kevin O'Keefe had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind a collapsed tent and a mystery that would never be solved. While Kevin O'Keefe's disappearance remained shrouded in silence, another tragedy on a massive scale was about to unfold in the skies above Europe. On July 17, 2014, the departure gate at Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport was bustling with activity. Hundreds of travelers were boarding Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, which was bound for Kuala Lumpur. The passengers on board represented a beautiful cross-section of humanity. There were families heading off on dream vacations, students returning home, and business professionals traveling for meetings. In total, there were 283 passengers and 15 crew members on board, bringing the total number of people on the flight to 298. The atmosphere inside the cabin was light and filled with excitement. In fact, before walking down the jet bridge, one of the passengers took a quick photo of the massive Boeing 777 sitting on the tarmac. He uploaded it to Facebook with a joking caption that read, "If we go missing, this is what the plane looks like." It was a lighthearted reference to another Malaysian Airlines flight, Flight 370, which had mysteriously vanished into the Indian Ocean just a couple of months earlier. No one could have imagined how tragic that joke would become. Once boarding was complete, another passenger uploaded a short video to Instagram. It showed people laughing, stuffing their carry-on bags into the overhead bins, and the captain's voice coming over the intercom, announcing that boarding was complete and asking everyone to turn off their cell phones in preparation for takeoff. A 15-year-old Dutch boy named Gary Slock and his mother, Petra, had just taken their seats. They were absolutely beaming. The two of them had signed up for a special vacation organized for single parents and their children. Gary was a talented young goalkeeper for his local soccer team, and he had spent the last week bragging to his teammates about this incredible trip he was about to take with his mom. Before turning his phone off, Gary decided to capture the moment. He held up his phone and took a selfie of himself and his mom. Both of them were grinning from ear to ear, clearly thrilled to be starting their adventure. Gary uploaded the photo to Facebook, turned his phone off, and buckled his seatbelt. The plane took off perfectly. It climbed steadily to its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. It was going to be a long 12-hour flight to Kuala Lumpur, so the passengers began to settle in. Some pulled out books, others turned on movies, and the flight attendants began rolling the beverage carts down the aisles, offering snacks and drinks. Outside the windows, the sky was a beautiful, clear blue. It was a perfectly normal, peaceful flight. About 3 hours after takeoff, at around 4 p.m., the captain of Flight MH17 checked in with air traffic control on the ground in Ukraine. The captain reported that everything was completely normal and that they were cruising smoothly. The air traffic controller acknowledged the transmission, but noticed there was some other aircraft in the area. The controller instructed the pilot to alter his course very slightly to maintain a safe distance. The pilot calmly acknowledged the instruction and began to explain his next maneuver, but mid-sentence, the radio went completely dead. The controllers in Ukraine immediately began trying to hail Flight MH17. They called out over the radio again and again, but there was only static. The plane had sent absolutely no distress signals, and there had been no signs of any mechanical trouble. This sudden, absolute silence made no sense. On the ground below, a 20-year-old bank teller named Yanina Brachenko was walking home when she happened to look up at the sky. What she saw in that moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she watched, the massive commercial airliner suddenly exploded in a brilliant flash of fire. The force of the blast was so violent that the fuselage tore apart instantly, and Yanena could clearly see objects and people being ejected from the plane at 33,000 feet. She watched in horror as debris and human bodies began raining down from the sky, crashing into the fields below in a massive fiery inferno. An international investigation would later reveal a horrifying truth. Flight MH17 had not suffered a mechanical failure. Instead, as the plane was flying over eastern Ukraine, a Russian-made surface-to-air missile had been fired at it by pro-Russian separatists. The military group had apparently mistaken the massive civilian airliner for a Ukrainian military transport plane. They fired the missile, which detonated right next to the cockpit, tearing the plane apart in seconds. All 298 innocent people on board were killed instantly. The selfie that young Gary Slock had taken with his mother Petra just moments before takeoff would circulate around the globe, a heartbreaking reminder of the innocent lives cut short by a senseless act of violence. While the tragedy of Flight MH17 was a sudden, violent act from above, some terrors are encountered right on the ground, in the most mundane places. After spending 21 years serving in the United States Army, a man retired and decided to move his family down to Central Florida. He had a solid military pension coming in, and his wife worked a stable, full-time job, so they had plenty of money. But the man quickly realized that retirement did not suit him. He got bored incredibly fast and decided he needed a simple job just to stay occupied and get out of the house. He ended up taking a job as a night cashier at a quiet gas station located right off a major highway. One of the main reasons he chose this specific job was because the owners of the station were incredibly laid back. They told him they did not care at all if his young son came to hang out with him during his shifts. His son could help stock shelves, sweep the floors, and sit behind the counter. For years, this was their routine. The father would work the night shift, and his son would tag along, keeping him company. Even as the boy grew into a teenager, he still looked forward to going to work with his dad. The town they lived in was so tiny that there was absolutely nothing else to do, so spending the night at the gas station was actually the highlight of his week. One dark night in 1990, the boy, who was now 15 years old, was taking a break from stocking shelves. He went outside and sat down at a wooden picnic table located near the side of the building. It was a warm, quiet night. There were no cars at the pumps, and there was barely any traffic on the highway. The boy was happily drinking a Mountain Dew and reading a magazine under the glow of the parking lot lights. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. He looked up and saw a woman walking off the highway, stepping onto the gas station property. Because the night was so quiet, she stood out immediately. The boy watched her walk across the asphalt, and he thought to himself how strange it was for someone to be walking to the station. Since they were located right off a major highway, every single customer drove there. He assumed her car must have broken down nearby, and she was coming to use their payphone to call a tow truck. The boy turned back to his magazine, but he kept looking up to keep an eye on her. He would later say that there was just something about her appearance and the way she walked that made him feel incredibly uneasy. The woman walked right past the picnic table where the boy was sitting. She did not look at him, acknowledge him, or say hello. She just stared straight ahead, opened the door, and walked inside the gas station. From his seat at the picnic table, the boy had a perfect view through the massive glass windows of the storefront. He could see his father standing behind the cash register, and he could see the top of the woman's head as she began walking through the aisles. The boy put his magazine down and watched her closely. He realized that she was not actually shopping. She would walk down an aisle, look down at a shelf for a few seconds, but she never picked anything up. Instead, she kept glancing up over the shelves, staring intently at his father behind the counter. She would look back down, move to the next aisle, and repeat the process. Eventually, the woman abandoned her fake shopping routine altogether. She walked straight up to the checkout counter where the boy's father was standing. Because the store was completely empty and the door was slightly propped open, the boy could hear their conversation clearly. The woman told the father that her car had broken down the road and she needed a ride. She asked if he would drive her to Ocala, which was the next major town located several miles north of the station. The boy expected his father to react with his usual friendly, helpful demeanor. His dad was a warm, chatty guy who loved talking to customers and helping people out. But to the boy's surprise, his father's attitude was completely different. His dad appeared incredibly cold, dismissive, and almost rude. He stared at the woman and flatly told her that he would not give her a ride. The woman was clearly annoyed by how quickly she had been shut down. But instead of leaving, she turned around and looked out the glass window, pointing her finger directly at the boy sitting on the picnic table. She looked back at the father and asked, "What about him? Is that your son? Can he give me a ride?" Inside the store, the father was standing at an angle where the woman could not see his face, but the boy could. The father was looking directly at his son, shaking his head side to side, silently but fiercely mouthing the word no. The boy was incredibly confused. He did not understand why his dad was being so hostile to a woman who clearly needed help, but he trusted his father implicitly. He knew that if she came outside to ask him, he would refuse. But it did not come to that. The father stepped forward, looked the woman in the eye, and told her that his son was absolutely not giving her a ride. He told her she needed to leave the property immediately and that she was not welcome to come back. The woman flew into a rage. She began screaming profanities at the father, slamming her fist on the counter. She stormed out of the gas station, slamming the glass door behind her. As she walked across the parking lot, she turned back and began screaming curses at the boy on the picnic table, flipping him off and shouting insults until she finally disappeared back onto the dark highway. The father walked outside and stood next to his son, watching the darkness where she had vanished. The boy looked up at his dad and asked what her deal was and why he had been so mean to her. The father sighed, looked down at his son, and said that he did not know. He said there was just something off about her, a strange vibe that he could not explain, but he knew he did not want her anywhere near his son. A year later, the boy was hanging out in his bedroom when he heard his father in the living room, screaming for him to come in and look at the television. The boy ran into the room, and there, plastered across the screen, was the face of the woman from the gas station. Her name was Eileen Wuornos, and she had just been arrested as one of the most prolific female serial killers in American history. Eileen was a highway prostitute who targeted men at gas stations, lured them away, and shot them to death. By the night she had walked into that quiet gas station, she had already murdered 4 people. Following her interaction with the father and son, she would go on to murder 3 more, including a man in Ocala, the very town she had tried to get them to drive her to. The boy and his father sat in stunned silence, realizing that the father's military intuition had saved both of their lives. Sometimes the danger is not a passing stranger, but someone who enters a life and slowly, methodically takes it over. In September of 2006, a 26-year-old woman named Jodi Arias attended a business convention in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was there that she met 29-year-old Travis Alexander. Travis was a handsome, highly successful motivational speaker and businessman. The chemistry between them was instant and incredibly powerful. On the very same day they met, Travis was so taken by Jodi that he invited her to be his +1 at his company's formal black-tie dinner that evening. After the dinner was over, the two stayed up until the sun came up, sitting in the lobby and talking about their lives, their dreams, and their beliefs. The very next day, Travis was practically glowing. He met up with his close friends at the convention and excitedly told them that he had finally found the woman he was going to marry. After the convention ended, Travis and Jodi began dating. Because Travis lived in Mesa, Arizona, and Jodi lived in California, it was a long-distance relationship. But they made it work. They would travel back and forth to see each other, taking beautiful photos of their trips and posting them all over social media. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like the ultimate dream couple, completely head over heels in love. But behind the perfect social media facade, a very dark reality was starting to unfold. Travis's close friends began to notice some incredibly strange and alarming behavior from Jodi. She seemed to be completely obsessed with Travis to an unhealthy degree. Whenever they were in public, Jodi could not seem to physically detach herself from him. Travis would be standing in a circle, having a professional conversation with his business partners, and Jodi would walk up, wrap her arms tightly around him, and literally cling to his body. Travis would visibly look embarrassed. He would gently try to push her off and ask for some space, but Jodi would ignore him and immediately grab onto him again. It was not a playful, cute gesture. It felt desperate and suffocating. Even worse, Jodi could not handle Travis interacting with any other females. It did not matter if the woman was a business colleague, an elderly neighbor, or a family member. If Travis was speaking to a woman, Jodi would stand nearby, staring at them with an intense, icy glare. She began following Travis everywhere he went. If he got up to go to the bathroom, Jodi would follow him down the hallway. Friends reported seeing Jodi standing outside the bathroom door with her ear pressed against the wood, listening to see if he was talking to someone else inside. She began showing up at Travis's house in Mesa completely unannounced, having driven hundreds of miles from California without telling him. One night, when Travis was not even home and the front door was locked, Jodi managed to sneak into the house by crawling through the small doggy door in the back. Initially, Travis's friends tried to laugh it off, thinking she was just quirky and insecure. But as the months went on, her behavior escalated and they began to worry for Travis's physical safety. They decided they needed to intervene. One afternoon, while Jodi was supposedly away, a group of Travis's closest friends sat him down in his living room. They told him flat out that Jodi was exhibiting classic signs of a stalker. They told him that her behavior was dangerous and they feared she would never let him go. They urged him to break off the relationship immediately, block her number, and cut all ties. Mid-sentence, the group heard a faint rustling noise coming from the hallway outside the closed living room door. Travis stood up, walked over, and yanked the door open. Standing right there in the hallway was Jodi. She had been standing in the dark, eavesdropping on their entire conversation. She did not look embarrassed. Instead, she stared past Travis, locking eyes with his friends, and gave them a look of absolute, cold hatred before turning around and storming out of the house, taking his friend's advice. Travis finally summoned the courage to break up with Jody. He told her that the relationship was over and that he wanted to move on. Because she lived in California, Travis assumed that the physical distance would give him the clean break he desperately needed. But he was terribly wrong. Just 2 weeks after the breakup, Jody packed up her entire life, moved to Arizona, and rented a place just minutes away from Travis's home. Around this same time, Travis began dating a new woman named Lisa. As soon as Jody found out, she launched a campaign of terror. She began stalking Lisa, showing up at her house in the middle of the night, tapping on her bedroom windows, and running away. Travis started finding his car tires slashed in his driveway on multiple occasions. She was making his life a living hell. But then, in April of 2008, Jody unexpectedly announced that she was moving back to California. Travis, Lisa, and all of Travis's friends let out a massive sigh of relief. They believed the nightmare was finally over. 2 months later, in June of 2008, Travis failed to show up for a major mandatory business meeting. At first, his colleagues called his phone, leaving joking messages about him sleeping in. But as the hours turned into days and Travis remained completely silent, his friends became deeply concerned. Travis was an incredibly reliable, professional guy who never missed work. 2 of his friends decided to drive over to his house to perform a welfare check. They let themselves in through the front door, and as they walked into the hallway, they immediately saw dark, copper-colored stains on the carpet. They began calling out Travis's name, but the house was dead silent. They walked up the stairs, following the trail of blood into the master bathroom. There, lying in the bathtub, they found Travis's body. He had been brutally murdered, the police were called, and they immediately suspected Jody Arias. When they contacted her, she put on a performance of shocked grief, claiming she was in California and had absolutely nothing to do with it. But the investigators were meticulous. As they processed the crime scene in the bathroom, they decided to look inside the washing machine. Inside, mixed in with some wet clothes, they found a digital camera. It had been run through a wash cycle, but forensic experts were able to dry it out and extract the photos from the memory card. The photos told a horrifying story. The first few pictures showed Jody herself, posing playfully inside Travis's house on the day of the murder. The next set of photos showed Travis sitting in the shower, looking directly at the camera, completely unaware of what was about to happen. And the very next photo on the card was a chaotic, blurry shot showing Travis's neck covered in blood. Immediately after taking that photo of him in the shower, Jody had attacked him with a knife, stabbing him 27 times, slitting his throat from ear to ear, and shooting him in the head. In May of 2013, after a highly publicized trial, Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While Jody Arias' obsession led to a calculated domestic horror, some tragedies occur because of a bizarre, sudden fixation on the wild. In 2014, a 20-year-old man named Maqsood Khan was living in Delhi, India. Maqsood was a quiet young man, but his family began to notice that he had developed an intense, consuming obsession with tigers. His wife and parents were not entirely sure where this fixation had come from, but they knew it had started right after a casual family trip to the local zoo. When Maqsood came home that day, he could not stop talking about the tigers he had seen, but his obsession was not just a typical love for animals. It was a dark, reverent fascination with the raw, savage nature of the predators. Maqsood would spend hours telling his friends a specific story about a tiger in captivity. He told them about how 2 trainers had entered the tiger's enclosure to place a decorative garland of flowers around its neck for a traditional ceremony. But the tiger was not having it. It snapped, attacking and killing both trainers in seconds. Maqsood did not tell this story to highlight the tragedy of the trainers' deaths. He told it with a sense of awe, deeply fascinated by the fact that even in captivity, the tiger remained untamable and in complete control. In May of 2014, Maqsood lost his job. This was unfortunately a common occurrence for him. Maqsood was known for being incredibly lazy, easily distracted, and happy-go-lucky. He simply did not take his responsibilities seriously. He had once been fired from a job unloading sacks from a truck because he saw a small lizard, got distracted, and ran off to chase it, leaving the truck half-loaded. But his family relied on him for income, so his parents told him he had to go out every day and look for a new job. Maqsood would leave the house every morning, telling his family he was heading out to submit resumes. But in reality, he was taking the family's spare change and using it to buy a ticket to the Delhi Zoo. He would spend his entire day standing in front of the white tiger exhibit, staring at the massive predators. For 4 months, this was his daily routine. On September 23, 2014, Maqsood was standing at the white tiger exhibit. The exhibit was designed with safety in mind. There was an outer metal fence that visitors stood against. Directly behind that fence was a small strip of grass which then dropped 15 feet straight down into a wide, water-filled protective moat. On the other side of the moat was the main island where the tigers lived. For some reason, which investigators would never fully understand, Maqsood decided he wanted a closer look. He climbed over the outer metal fence, ignoring the warning signs, and stood on the narrow strip of grass right at the edge of the 15-foot drop. The security guards and other visitors immediately noticed him and began screaming at him to climb back over the fence. But Maksud ignored them, staring down into the moat. Suddenly, Maksud lost his footing. He slipped and fell 15 feet, crashing hard into the dry concrete side of the moat. The fall triggered an immediate security alarm, and the sudden noise woke up a massive 7-foot-long male white tiger named Vijay. Vijay stood up, looked around, and saw Maksud lying in the moat. Up above, the crowd of visitors was in a state of absolute panic. People were screaming, crying, and filming with their phones. This chaotic noise deeply agitated the tiger. Vijay slowly climbed down into the moat and walked directly up to Maksud. Maksud was absolutely terrified. He sat up, pulled his knees to his chest, and pressed his back hard against the concrete wall, bringing his hands together in a prayer gesture, silently begging the tiger for mercy. Surprisingly, Vijay did not immediately attack. The tiger simply stood there, inches away, staring at Maksud with curiosity, sniffing at him. But up above, the crowd's panic escalated. Instead of waiting for the zookeepers to arrive with tranquilizer guns, some of the visitors decided to take matters into their own hands. They began picking up large rocks from the pathways and throwing them down at the tiger, trying to scare it away from Maksud. For 10 minutes, rocks rained down on Vijay, hitting him in the back and head. The tiger grew increasingly angry and agitated by the pain. Finally, Vijay snapped. He lunged forward, clamped his massive jaws firmly around Maksud's neck, and easily dragged him across the concrete floor into a grassy, hidden corner of the enclosure. By the time zookeepers finally arrived on the scene with tranquilizer equipment, it was far too late. Maksud was already dead. A single photo of Maksud, cowering in the corner while the tiger stared at him moments before the attack, would go viral worldwide. The local police would ultimately charge the zoo administration with death by negligence due to their incredibly slow response time and their lack of emergency rescue protocols. While Maksud's fate was decided in a matter of minutes inside a crowded zoo, some hikers enter the wilderness and find themselves facing a quiet, inexplicable vanishing. In April of 1976, 19-year-old Stephen Thomas was living in New York when his good friend Bruce Weaver invited him on a weekend hiking trip. Bruce had put together a group with 4 of his other friends, whom Stephen did not know. But Stephen loved the outdoors and was an experienced hiker, so he happily agreed to go. The destination was Mount Marcy, the highest peak in the state of New York. Mount Marcy is a beautiful mountain, but it is also incredibly rugged, windy, and dangerous. The weather can change in an instant, and near the summit, temperatures can drop well below freezing even in the spring. On the morning Stephen was packing his gear to leave, his mother walked into his room. She looked at him and told him that she had a horrible sinking feeling about this trip. She begged him to cancel, telling him it was not a good idea to climb such a dangerous mountain with people he did not know well. But Stephen laughed it off, gave his mother a hug, and told her he would see her in a couple of days. On the morning of April 12, 1976, the 6 young men began their trek up Mount Marcy. By 3:30 p.m. that afternoon, they had made significant progress and were nearing the summit. However, the climb had been grueling, and most of the group was completely exhausted. They decided to halt, pitch their tents, and make camp for the night, planning to tackle the final stretch to the summit the following morning. Everyone was relieved to rest except for Stephen. Stephen was restless. He sat inside Bruce's tent, staring intently at the trail map. He looked at Bruce and asked if he wanted to go for a quick walk up the path just to see what was ahead. Bruce shook his head, telling Stephen he was too tired and that they should just wait for tomorrow. Stephen continued to study the map, made himself a cup of tea, and then folded the map up. He told Bruce he was just going to walk a little way up the trail by himself and would be back in a few minutes. Bruce strongly advised him against it. He pointed out that it was getting dark, the wind was picking up, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He told Stephen there was absolutely no reason to go up there alone. The other hikers also told Stephen to just stay in the warm tent. But Stephen ignored their warnings. He threw on a bright yellow rain jacket over his t-shirt and pants, left his heavy backpack and all of his survival gear in the tent, and walked out into the cold. Because Stephen had significant hiking experience in the rugged mountains of Washington state, the group assumed he would be fine. The snow on the trail was hard-packed, making it easy to walk on, and there was a bright full moon providing excellent visibility. They figured he would walk for 10 minutes, get cold, and come right back. But an hour passed and Stephen did not return. By now, it was pitch black, and the temperature had plummeted well below freezing. Stephen was only wearing a light t-shirt under his rain jacket with no gloves or hat. The hikers walked a short distance up the trail, shouting Stephen's name into the darkness, but their voices were swallowed by the howling wind. Realizing Stephen was in extreme danger of hypothermia, they hurried back to their tents to grab their heavy gear and flashlights to launch a search. One of the hikers had brought his dog on the trip. This dog was an incredibly high-energy, adventurous animal that loved being outdoors. Whenever the owner grabbed his leash, the dog would leap with excitement. But when the owner entered the tent to grab his gear and called for his dog to join the search, the dog refused to move. The dog had crawled into the very back corner of the tent, trembling violently. It whimpered, cowering in fear, and absolutely refused to step outside into the night. The owner was stunned. He had never seen his dog act this way. It seemed terrified of something lurking just outside the fabric of the tent. The hikers were forced to leave the dog behind and search on their own. They searched the trail for hours in the freezing cold, but they found absolutely no sign of Stephen. With their own lives now at risk from the extreme cold, they were forced to return to their tents, praying Stephen had found shelter. At sunrise, they resumed the search, but the mountain was empty. Half the group hiked 4 hours down the mountain to contact the forest rangers, while the others stayed at the camp in case Stephen returned. The state of New York launched one of the largest search and rescue operations in its history. For 2 weeks, helicopters, canine units, and hundreds of ground searchers combed every square inch of Mount Marcy. Despite Stephen wearing a highly visible bright yellow rain jacket, they found absolutely nothing. He had completely vanished. After the official search was called off, Stephen's 26-year-old brother Bob refused to give up. Bob was in peak physical condition and shared a deep bond with his brother. He quit his job, moved to the Mount Marcy area, and spent the next entire year searching the mountain. Bob summited Mount Marcy over 600 times, walking more than 2,500 miles along different off-trail routes. He became more familiar with the mountain than the local rangers. While Bob never found a single trace of his brother Stephen, his search did lead him to the skeletal remains of another hiker who had gone missing 3 years prior, bringing closure to that family. But as for Stephen, no clue was ever found. The mystery of what terrified the dog, and how a young man in a bright yellow jacket vanished without a trace on a well-lit trail, remains unsolved. While the forests of Mount Marcy hold their secrets in silence, other wilderness encounters are revealed only years later through the chilling confessions of monsters. In the late 1970s, a young man and a young woman living in Utah went out on their very first date. The date was not going well. It was not a disaster, but it was incredibly awkward. They had very little in common, and the conversation was stiff and forced. As the evening was winding down and they were preparing to head home, the young man decided he had nothing to lose. He knew they probably would not go on a second date, so he decided to propose something completely unexpected. He looked at the woman and asked if she wanted to go on a nighttime hike with him in Provo Canyon. He admitted it sounded like a strange idea, but explained that he went climbing there all the time. He told her there were beautiful, safe trails that led up the side of the canyon to gorgeous scenic overlooks. He pointed out that it was a clear night with a new moon, meaning the stars would be incredible, and promised that if she felt uncomfortable at any point, they would immediately turn around and leave. After a bit of hesitation, the woman decided to go for it. The awkwardness of the date suddenly melted away, replaced by a sense of spontaneous adventure. They drove up to the mouth of Provo Canyon, parked the car, and began walking up the trail. The path led them deep into a heavily forested, dense section of the canyon. Up to this point, the young man had felt completely confident. But as soon as they stepped under the dark canopy of the trees, he was hit by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of dread. He had no logical explanation for it. It was a physical sensation of pure anxiety, a voice in his head screaming that they were in extreme danger and needed to run. But because he had worked so hard to convince her that it was safe, he did not want to look like a coward. He suppressed his fear, put on a brave face, and kept walking, gripping her hand tightly. What he did not know was that the woman was experiencing the exact same overwhelming sense of terror. She felt a cold chill run down her spine the moment they entered the trees. But she kept quiet because she did not want to ruin his excitement. They continued walking down the pitch-black trail in tense silence. Suddenly, the man's foot stepped on something soft and yielding in the middle of the path. He froze instantly, pulling the woman to a halt. Before he could even look down to see what his foot was resting on, a loud, violent rustling sound erupted from the thick bushes just 3 feet off the side of the trail. The sheer panic was too much to bear. Without saying a single word to each other, the man and woman spun around and ran as fast as they could back down the trail, hopped into their car, and sped away, never returning to the canyon. Years later, that same young man and woman were happily married, sitting in their living room watching television. They were flipping through the channels when they landed on a live broadcast of a death row interview with a notorious serial killer. The interviewer asked the killer if there was ever a time when he had almost been caught red-handed. The killer smiled at the camera and said yes, there was one night. He explained that he was in the woods of Provo Canyon, having just murdered a young woman. As he was standing over her body, he suddenly heard footsteps approaching. He did not have time to run, so he quickly dragged the body onto the edge of the path and dove into the thick bushes right next to the trail. The killer stated that a young couple came walking up the path in the dark. He said the young man actually stepped directly on the corpse of the girl he had just killed. But because it was so dark, the man did not look down. The killer confessed that he was crouching just inches away in the bushes, preparing to spring out and kill them both if they noticed him. But instead, they suddenly panicked, turned around, and ran away. The couple sat in their living room, staring at the television in absolute, paralyzing horror. The man on the screen was Ted Bundy, one of the most prolific serial killers in history. They realized that on their very first date, they had stood inches away from a monster in the dark. For some, the threat is a notorious killer waiting in the woods, while for others, the threat comes from inside their own home, disguised as a loving son. From all outward appearances, Bart Whitaker loved his family deeply. Bart and his younger brother, Kevin, were incredibly close, sharing a tight sibling bond. Bart and his father, Kent, shared a deep passion for long-distance cycling, often spending their weekends riding together through their upscale neighborhood in Sugar Land, Texas. The Whitaker family was wealthy, regularly taking lavish vacations to beautiful destinations like Cancun, Mexico. In all of the family vacation photos, Bart can be seen smiling warmly, hugging his parents and brother, looking like the picture of health, loving son. On December 10, 2003, 23-year-old Bart made a major announcement to his family. He proudly told them that he had just finished taking his final exams for his senior year at Sam Houston State College, and that he was officially graduating. Bart had always struggled with academics, so this was a massive achievement. His parents were absolutely thrilled and incredibly proud. They insisted they had to go out for a massive celebration. They drove to an expensive, high-end restaurant in Houston. During the dinner, Kent and his wife, Patricia, pulled out a small box. Inside was a beautiful, expensive Rolex watch. They presented it to Bart as a graduation gift, telling him how proud they were of his hard work. They asked a nearby diner to take a family photo. In the picture, the four of them are beaming, holding each other close, celebrating Bart's bright future. After a wonderful dinner, they piled into the family car and made the 40-minute drive back to their home in Sugar Land. The parents spent the entire drive talking about how excited they were for Bart. They pulled into the driveway, got out of the car, and walked toward the front door. Bart trailed slightly behind them. As they reached the porch, Bart suddenly stopped and said he had forgotten his cell phone in the console of the car. He turned around and walked back down the driveway. As Patricia, Kent, and young Kevin opened the front door and stepped into the dark foyer of their home, they were immediately met by a hail of gunfire. An assassin, dressed in black and armed with a handgun, was waiting in the shadows of the living room. Kevin and Patricia were shot multiple times and collapsed to the floor. Kent was shot in the chest, falling backward onto the porch. Hearing the screams and gunfire, Bart ran back toward the house. He entered the foyer and reportedly began wrestling with the gunman, trying to disarm him. During the struggle, the gunman shot Bart in the arm before running out the back door and escaping into the night. A neighbor heard the gunshots, ran outside, and discovered the horrific scene. Emergency services rushed to the home. Tragically, Patricia and Kevin died at the scene from their wounds. Bart and his father, Kent, were rushed to the hospital, where they both miraculously made a full recovery. The police immediately launched a massive investigation into who would want to target the wealthy, respected Whitaker family. But as they dug into the family's lives, they uncovered a web of lies so deep it defied belief. It turned out that Bart Whitaker was not graduating. In fact, he had dropped out of Sam Houston State College months prior and had not attended a single class. He had been lying to his parents for years, pocketing the tuition money they sent him. And the investigation quickly revealed an even more sinister truth. Bart had hired a college friend to act as the gunman, planning the entire massacre down to the last detail. His motive was simple. He wanted to inherit his family's multi-million-dollar estate. He had instructed the gunman to shoot him in the arm to make him look like a grieving, innocent victim. In the family photo taken at the restaurant just hours before the shooting, Bart is holding his new Rolex, smiling warmly. But Bart knew that at that exact moment, the assassin he hired was sitting in the dark inside their family home, waiting for them to return. He knew that his mother and brother would be dead in a matter of hours. In 2007, Bart Whitaker was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. However, in a bizarre twist of fate, just 40 minutes before his scheduled execution, the governor of Texas commuted his sentence to life in prison. This was done at the desperate pleading of Bart's father, Kent. Despite having his wife and youngest son murdered and being shot in the chest himself, Kent had chosen to forgive Bart and did not want to see his only remaining family member executed, while Bart Whitaker plotted a cold, calculated betrayal of those who loved him. Some killers are driven by a sudden, delusional obsession with absolute strangers. Shortly after the Beatles officially dissolved in 1969, one of its founding members, John Lennon, decided to leave England and move to New York City. John and his wife, Yoko Ono, bought an apartment in the Dakota, a highly prestigious and historic building known for housing the city's rich and famous. John loved living in New York. He often told interviewers that he felt a sense of peace there. In England, he could not step outside without being mobbed by thousands of screaming fans. But in New York, people were respectful. They might ask for an autograph, but they mostly left him alone to walk the streets like a normal citizen. Meanwhile, a young man named Mark David Chapman was living in Georgia, and he had always been an obsessed fan of the Beatles, particularly John Lennon. Chapman learned to play the guitar because of John, and he emulated his style. But in 1966, John Lennon made his famous comment during an interview where he stated that the Beatles were now more popular than Jesus. This statement deeply offended Chapman, who was a devout fundamentalist Christian. His admiration for John quickly curdled into a dark, toxic hatred. One of Chapman's high school friends later recalled that around this time, Chapman played the song Imagine for him, but had rewritten the lyrics to say, "Imagine if John Lennon was dead." Chapman began to view John as a massive hypocrite, a man who sang about peace, love, and having no possessions, while living a life of extreme luxury in a multi-million-dollar New York penthouse. By 1980, Chapman's hatred had become a full-blown psychiatric obsession. In October of that year, Chapman quit his job as a security guard in Hawaii and flew to New York City. For 2 months, he stayed in cheap hotels, doing very little except periodically walking past the Dakota building, studying the entrance, and waiting. On December 8, 1980, Chapman decided it was the day. He stood outside the entrance to the Dakota, blending in with the small crowd of fans who regularly gathered there. At 5 p.m., John Lennon and Yoko Ono walked out of the building's archway, heading toward a waiting limousine. Chapman stepped forward holding a copy of John's latest album, Double Fantasy. He flagged John down and asked if he would sign it. Even though he had a tight schedule, John stopped. He took the album, signed his name, and warmly asked Chapman if that was all he wanted or if he needed anything else. Chapman, stunned by John's kindness, simply nodded and said no, that was it. John smiled, told him to take care, and got into the limousine. A photographer standing nearby captured a photo of this interaction, showing John signing the album while Chapman stood next to him. Staring down, at 10:50 p.m. that night, the limousine returned to the Dakota. John and Yoko got out and walked through the dark archway toward the entrance. Chapman was still there, waiting in the shadows. As John walked past him, Chapman pulled out a 5-shot revolver. He stepped back, took aim, and fired 5 hollow-point bullets into John's back and shoulder. John staggered into the building's lobby, screaming that he had been shot before collapsing. Chapman did not run. He calmly took off his coat, put the gun on the ground, and pulled out a copy of the book The Catcher in the Rye. He sat down on the sidewalk and began reading, waiting for the police to arrive. John Lennon was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead on arrival. Chapman's defense attorneys wanted him to plead insanity, but Chapman refused. He insisted he was completely sane and that he had killed John Lennon for one simple reason. He wanted to become famous. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, where he remains to this day, having been denied parole 12 consecutive times. While Mark David Chapman sought fame through a sudden, shocking act of violence, other lives end in complete isolation, leaving behind clues that make no logical sense. In the year 2000, Patrick Wan was a 33-year-old man living in Montana. Patrick was the ultimate outdoorsman, bordering on a full-blown survivalist. He had hiked thousands of miles along the Pacific Crest Trail and had spent hundreds of hours solo camping in the most remote areas of the country. His absolute favorite place in the world was Glacier National Park in Montana. He spent so much time there that the park rangers all knew him by name and considered him highly capable of surviving any situation. On November 2, 2000, Patrick was driving his pickup truck near Cowa Junction, Montana, when he accidentally struck a deer. Several witnesses watched the bizarre scene that followed. Patrick stopped his truck in the middle of the road, got out, and walked over to the injured deer. He gently dragged it to the shoulder of the road. He then went back to his truck, grabbed a pillow, and placed it under the deer's head. Next, he retrieved some food from his vehicle and placed it near the deer's mouth. Without checking the damage to his truck, Patrick simply turned around and walked away into the dense woods, abandoning his vehicle. The truck was towed the following day, but Patrick never came to claim it. 6 months after the incident, Patrick's father contacted the rangers at Glacier National Park. He explained that he had not heard from his son in months and that Patrick's truck had been found abandoned. He told them that if Patrick was anywhere, he would be in Glacier National Park. The rangers promised to keep an eye out, though they knew the park was massive. A few weeks later, 2 rangers were on a routine patrol in an extremely remote, off-trail section of the park when they spotted a blue tent pitched in the middle of a dense cluster of trees. The tent was partially collapsed, with the center support pole snapped. The rangers called out Patrick's name, but there was no response. They walked up to the tent and examined it. It was heavily weathered and faded from the sun, indicating it had been sitting there for months. But there were no tears in the fabric, and all of the heavy-duty zippers were completely shut. When they unzipped the tent, they found it empty of people, but filled with Patrick's gear. His boots, his cooking stove, his warm clothes, and his sleeping bag were all neatly laid out inside. There was also a significant amount of food stored inside the tent. The rangers noted that it was incredibly strange that no wild animals had ransacked the tent. In a park filled with hungry grizzly bears, a tent containing food left unattended for 6 months should have been torn to shreds. But it was completely untouched. The authorities launched a search of the surrounding wilderness. They used search dogs and ground teams, but found no trace of Patrick. However, investigators did find one incredibly chilling clue inside the tent. Resting on top of Patrick's sleeping bag was an empty leather sheath for a buck knife. The knife itself was missing. This led to a terrifying theory. Patrick must have been inside his tent one night when he heard something approaching outside. Whatever it was threatening enough that Patrick felt the need to unsheath his large knife. To prevent mosquitoes from entering, he zipped the tent shut behind him, stepped out into the dark to confront the threat, and was never seen again. Because there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, and no animal tracks, the mystery of what Patrick went out to confront remains one of the park's most haunting secrets. While some face their end in the quiet mystery of the woods, others are caught in sudden, cataclysmic natural disasters that capture the attention of the entire world. By September of 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia was showing signs of extreme instability. Powerful tremors shook the ground daily, causing massive concern for the citizens of Armero, a bustling town of 31,000 people located just 30 miles from the peak. Despite the warnings, local officials assured the residents that they were safe and did not need to evacuate. This would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. On the night of November 13, 1985, the volcano erupted violently. The heat from the eruption instantly melted the massive glaciers on the mountain, sending a wall of mud, water, and volcanic debris rushing down the river valleys. This massive mudslide, known as a lahar, struck the town of Armero while most of its residents were asleep. The thick, heavy sludge covered 85% of the town, instantly crushing buildings, sweeping away bridges, and trapping thousands of people in their homes. Out of the 31,000 residents, over 25,000 were killed in a matter of minutes. Because the disaster was so massive and the terrain was completely covered in thick, impassable mud, rescue efforts were incredibly slow to mobilize. For days, survivors remained trapped in the debris, dying of exposure and injuries before help could reach them. 2 days after the eruption, a French photojournalist named Frank Fournier arrived in Armero to document the rescue efforts. He was shocked by the absolute chaos. There was no coordination, and rescuers lacked basic equipment like shovels or water pumps. A local farmer approached Frank and told him he needed to come quickly to help a young girl who was trapped. The farmer led Frank to a ruined house that was completely submerged in a pool of muddy water. Clinging to a floating tree branch was a 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez. Omaira was submerged up to her neck in the freezing, toxic water. Rescuers had been trying to pull her out, but she was pinned by something beneath the surface. Despite her horrific situation, Omaira was in incredibly high spirits. She sang to the rescuers, joked about not wanting to be late for school, and asked for sweet food. But as the hours dragged on and the cold water continued to rise from the rain, Omaira's condition deteriorated. She began to hallucinate, telling the rescuers to leave her so she could rest. Rescuers realized with horror why they could not pull her out. Her legs were pinned beneath a heavy concrete door, and the hands of her deceased aunt, who had drowned beneath her, were locked around Omaira's ankles in a permanent death grip. Without a water pump to drain the pool or heavy machinery to lift the concrete, they were completely helpless. Frank Fournier stood by, devastated. He could do nothing but hold her hand and comfort her. He took a photo of Omaira, capturing her dark, bloodshot eyes staring directly into the lens with a sense of calm acceptance. 3 hours after the photo was taken, Omaira suffered a heart attack from exposure and passed away. The photo was published worldwide, winning the 1986 World Press Photo of the Year. It sparked international outrage over the Colombian government's failure to provide basic rescue equipment, turning Omaira into a global symbol of tragedy and resilience. While Omaira was trapped by a slow, visible disaster, some people survived terrifying encounters with monsters simply by trusting their instincts and acting fast. In the late 1970s, a young medical student in Chicago, Illinois, had just finished a long day of classes. He was exhausted and did not want to spend his limited money on a taxi ride home. At the time, hitchhiking was still relatively common and socially acceptable, so he walked down to a busy road, stood on the shoulder, and put his thumb out. After a few minutes, a clean, well-maintained car pulled over. The driver was a middle-aged, stocky man who looked completely normal, friendly, and harmless. He rolled down the window, smiled, and told the student to hop in. The student did not feel any sense of danger, so he opened the passenger door and slid into the front seat. He gave the driver his address, and the man nodded warmly, pulling back into traffic. At first, the ride was completely normal. But as they drove, the student noticed that they were approaching the turnoff that led to his neighborhood. The driver did not slow down and completely blew past the turn. The student turned to the man, assuming he had just missed it, and politely pointed out the mistake. He told the driver he could just pull over and drop him off there, and that he would gladly walk the rest of the way. In an instant, the driver's friendly, warm demeanor completely vanished. His face went entirely blank and his eyes turned cold and dark. He turned his head slowly, stared at the student, and said in a flat, terrifying voice, "Oh no, you are coming with me." The student was paralyzed with fear, realizing he had just gotten into a car with a predator. He knew that if he let this man take him to a second location, he would not survive the night. He had to make a choice. As the car slowed down slightly to navigate a bend in the road, the student grabbed the door handle, pushed the door open, and leaped out of the moving vehicle. He crashed hard onto the asphalt, rolling onto the gravel shoulder. He was badly bruised and scraped, but he scrambled to his feet and ran as fast as he could back toward his house. The student did not contact the police. He felt that because he did not have the license plate number, a good description of the car, or any evidence of an actual crime other than a verbal threat, the police would not be able to do anything. He simply felt incredibly lucky to have escaped and tried to put the terrifying incident behind him. 2 years later, the student was sitting in a local cafe, drinking coffee, when he heard a news report on the television behind him. The reporter was discussing a notorious serial killer who had just been arrested in Chicago. The reporter stated that police had discovered a highly unusual modification inside the killer's vehicle. The killer had completely removed all of the interior door handles on the passenger side. This was reportedly done after his very first potential victim, a young college student, had managed to escape by jumping out of the moving car. The medical student ran over to the television screen. There, staring back at him, was the mugshot of the driver who had picked him up 2 years earlier. His name was John Wayne Gacy, the infamous killer clown. Gacy had lured, tortured, and murdered over 33 young men and boys, burying most of them in the crawl space beneath his house. The student realized with a chill that his quick thinking was the only reason he had not become Gacy's very first victim. Sometimes, a tragedy is captured in real time, leaving behind a physical record of the final moments of those who had no idea what was coming. John and Jackie Nill were a happily married Canadian couple who shared a deep, lifelong passion for travel. Their absolute favorite destination in the world was Thailand. They loved the culture, the food, and the beautiful beaches so much that they openly referred to the country as their second home. In December of 2004, John and Jackie realized they were officially empty nesters. Their children were grown and busy with their own lives, so the couple decided to do something special for Christmas. Instead of staying in cold Canada, they booked a trip to spend the holidays in Khao Lak, a gorgeous, pristine beach town in southern Thailand. They were incredibly excited to spend Christmas lounging on the warm sand, listening to the waves. On Christmas Day, they called their children back in Canada. They laughed, told them they were having the absolute time of their lives, and described how beautiful the beach was right outside their villa. By all accounts, their vacation was completely perfect. On the morning of December 26th, the day after Christmas, John and Jackie woke up early and decided to head down to the beach. But as they stepped out of their villa, they noticed a massive crowd of tourists standing on the sand, staring out at the ocean. Intrigued, John and Jackie walked down to join them. What they saw was a bizarre, mesmerizing spectacle. The ocean had completely receded. The tide had gone out so far that hundreds of meters of the seafloor were completely exposed, leaving fish flopping on the dry sand and revealing reefs that had never been seen before. It looked like a miracle. John and Jackie, like everyone else on the beach, had no idea what this actually meant. They did not know that an incredibly powerful 9.1 magnitude earthquake had struck off the coast of Sumatra hours earlier, and that the rapidly receding water was the classic final warning sign of an approaching tsunami. Instead of running for high ground, the crowd walked out onto the newly exposed seafloor. John and Jackie pulled out their digital camera and began taking photos of the beautiful, strange landscape. They took photos of the empty bay, of the smiling tourists, and of themselves. But as they looked through their camera lens, they noticed a dark line appearing on the horizon. The line grew taller and wider with every passing second. John and Jackie kept taking photos, capturing the massive, churning wall of white water as it roared toward the shore. They captured photos of the realization of the crowd as people began to turn and run in absolute panic. The final photo on their camera showed a towering 100-foot wall of water crashing down directly over the beach. John and Jackie Nill, along with over 230,000 other people across 14 countries, were swept away and killed by the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami. A month after the disaster, a relief worker was walking along the heavily damaged beach of Khao Lak when they spotted a digital camera half buried in the sand. The camera was completely smashed and ruined by the salt water, but the worker carefully removed the plastic SIM card from inside. The worker took the card back to their computer, plugged it in, and was shocked to find that all of the photos were completely intact. The photos provided a detailed, heartbreaking, second-by-second record of the final moments of John and Jackie Nill, showing a couple celebrating the trip of their dreams, completely unaware that the beautiful ocean they loved was about to take their lives. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.